When we come to the text of the New Testament and trying to determine what the autographs are actually about, one of the great problems we have is the amount of material that we have to look at. Livy, we are waiting 300 years before we see any copies of his writings, and we don't see the full array of what he wrote about Roman history. Most of it's simply lost forever without any knowledge of where it went to. We have a grand total of about 30 copies of Livy in existence today that we can examine to try to see what he had to say. And we are waiting for 800 years before we see any copies of Tacitus's works. And the grand total that we have are three. 3 copies of Tacitus. We have quite a bit of material from Suetonius. We have over 200 manuscripts from Suetonius. But again, like Tacitus, we are waiting 800 years before we get any copies of his writings. We have, for our New Testament manuscripts, at the present time, close to 5,800 copies of these manuscripts in Greek alone. Now, if you were to wipe out all of the Greek manuscripts, this is what the text of the New Testament was originally written in, Greek. If you were to wipe out all of those, we could still reproduce the text of the New Testament many, many times over from the witnesses that we have in Latin, which were as early as the 2nd century. And the Latin text, we have over 10,000 copies of Latin manuscripts of the New Testament in existence today. We could reproduce the text in Latin and Coptic. Coptic is an ancient Egyptian language. It's essentially Egyptian hieroglyphics that are put into Greek letters. And the Coptic text starts as early as the 3rd century. We have hundreds of Coptic manuscripts today. In fact, we have probably at least 1,500 Coptic manuscripts, if not quite a few more, that have not yet been cataloged. Besides Coptic, we also have Syriac, another very, very important ancient copy of the New Testament, and we have hundreds of copies of Syriac. Then the New Testament was translated into many other languages. It was translated into Georgian, into Gothic, into Arabic. It was translated into Old Church Slavonic, into Anglo-Saxon and Armenian. We have so many copies of the New Testament in all these versions that there are surely between 15,000 and 20,000 copies of the New Testament not in Greek, written on handwritten manuscripts. With Livy, Suetonius, and Tacitus, we're dealing with the earliest manuscripts coming 300 years, and those are only of Livy, and then Suetonius and Tacitus, we're waiting 800 years before we get copies. These are fairly representative for ancient Greco-Roman authors. We have approximately 1,000% as many copies of the New Testament in its various languages as we do copies of Homer. It's a remarkable difference, and he is in 2nd place in terms of literary remains among all Greco-Roman literature. But there are other manuscripts from the 2nd century as well. Papyrus number 66, which is at the Bodmer Museum in Cologne, Switzerland, on the shores of Lake Geneva, is a remarkable manuscript that has most of John's Gospel in it. It doesn't have the entirety of John anymore. The outside leaves have fallen off, and from chapters 14 on, it's fairly fragmentary. But P66 is a manuscript that was dated somewhere between AD 150 and AD 200, and yet it's got most of John's Gospel in it. Really a remarkable text. We also have several other manuscripts, P4, P64, P67. We've got others that are possibly 2nd century, what's known as P75, which is a document that has both Luke and John in it, the vast majority of those verses. P46 is the earliest document we have of Paul's letters that number as many as 10 or 12 manuscripts that are dated to about that time period. Now, in terms of how much material of the New Testament they have, the remarkable thing is that approximately 43% of all the verses of the New Testament, not the entirety of each verse, but 43% of parts of those verses, and in most instances the majority of those verses, are found in these manuscripts that are dated to the 2nd century or to the 2nd/3rd century. By the time we get to within 300 years of the completion of the New Testament, we have well over 100 manuscripts in Greek alone, not counting the other ancient languages, the other ancient versions, that have the text of the New Testament, including our first complete Greek New Testament manuscript that has every book of the New Testament. There's nothing in the ancient world that comes close to that in terms of the completion of material and the date of the material. We just don't have any parallels at all that even stand a chance against the materials we have for the New Testament. The average author has fewer than, and I'm giving a very liberal estimate here, fewer than 20 copies of his literary remains still in existence. If you were to stack those literary remains up, how tall would it be? Well, on average, it would end up being about 4 feet high. If we had 20 copies of the remains, you'd get up to 4 feet high. Now, take the New Testament manuscripts in the Greek and all the ancient versions. How high would that stack be? That would be closer to about a mile high. It's a huge difference between these ancient Greco-Roman authors and their literary remains and what we have for the New Testament. We also have the fathers of the church, or ancient bishops and presbyters and elders and deacons who wrote commentaries and homilies on the New Testament. Well over 1 million quotations of the New Testament by the church fathers for this period of time. That's a huge amount of resources, and the entire New Testament is reproduced again many times over in the writings of these church fathers. The remarkable thing is the average other Greco-Roman literature, the average author from Greece or from Rome, has no literary remains for at least 300 years, while as the New Testament has well over 100 copies in Greek alone within the first 300 years of the completion of the New Testament.